Hi guys, my name is Tensor. Welcome to another Flutter tutorial. Today we're going to be looking at how we can create a package for Flutter. So a package is just a library that we can import into a project, and it gives that project extra functionality. In this example, we'll be building a simple widget which will give us the ability to manipulate the style of text that we put inside of it. Specifically, we'll make it so that we can just have shadow behind the text. To create a new package for Flutter, you want to run the flutter create command, and then you want to pass in the flag template, and you want to set that equal to the package. And then we want to pass in the name of our package, which in this case will be shaded_text. When you run this, you'll see that it will create a bunch of files, and then it will get the packages, which in this case is just the Flutter SDK. And now we can open the directory inside of the editor of choice that we're using. In this case, I'm using Visual Studio Code. So you can see here, this is just the generated package. We have this library shaded text, and then inside of it, it has this boilerplate for a calculator that allows us to add 1 to a value. And it's really just nothing. We can just get rid of it. You'll notice that inside of the directory here, we have no Android or iOS code. And that's because we're making a package. A package in Flutter is just a purely Dart-based plugin for the Flutter SDK, whereas a plugin template brings in the language of choice that you want to use for either Android or iOS or both. So if we wanted to create something that communicated with the platform, instead of passing in package, we would pass in plugin, and that would generate a bunch of Android and iOS code for us. If we open up the pubspec.yaml, you can see that we do have our dependencies, so we're dependent on the Flutter SDK, and it does allow us to put in stuff for the author and the homepage field, and we can manipulate the version and put in a new description and all of that stuff. And this pubspec.yaml is structured like any other Flutter project pubspec.yaml file. You can see that we can bring in fonts and we can bring in assets if we need them inside of this particular plugin. But in this tutorial, of course, we do not need any of that. Coming back into the shaded_text.dart file, you'll notice at the top we have this library declaration. You mainly want this for when you have multiple different files that you're using and you want to sort of tie them together in a module system. In our case, we only are going to be using the one file. I'm just going to leave the library up there just because it doesn't hurt anything. But usually when you have a single file that you're going to be building for your library, you don't really want the library declaration. Because we have the Flutter SDK as one of our dependencies, we can import any of the libraries from the Flutter SDK. And for this plugin, I can just bring in the material package as well as the meta package. At the top of our file, let's create a type definition for a builder function. We'll call this builder function our shade builder. And what it is essentially is just a type definition that says that we want a function which returns a widget that takes in the build context, a string, and then a color. So you could use this to create various custom types. In this case, we're just creating a specific type for a function, and we'll be able to use this inside of our library to sort of make things easier on ourselves. The actual widget that we're going to build will be a stateless widget. We'll just call it shaded text, and we'll have it, of course, extend stateless widget. Inside of this stateless widget, we can create some final fields. We want to have our shade builder, so this will be the actual shade builder type that we just created with our type definition. We also want to bring in a string, which will be the actual text that we're applying this shadow or shade to. Then we'll have two colors. One will be a shade color, and the other one will be the color of the actual text. With these fields declared, we can now create the actual constructor for our application, and we can use our meta package to specifically label the fields that we want to be required for this object to be built. So in this case, we need the shade builder, the text, the shade color, and then the text color, and we want all of these fields not to be null. If you go into the source code for many of the widgets that are already built inside of the Flutter SDK, you'll often see large constructors like this with tons of different required flags built in. And then you'll also see a lot of fields that are not specifically required. If we want to, we can add more guards to our constructor, and these guards will make sure that our fields are never null. So if the user puts in null for the shade builder or for the shade color or shade text or for even the text itself, then this will throw back an exception which will tell the user that they need to fill in that field. Now the main difference between making these assertions and then having these required meta flags is that the assertions themselves stop the user from putting null into the actual field, whereas the required tag just says that we need some value for this particular field inside of our shaded text, and that value could be null even if it is required. So yeah, using these assertion guards can be pretty useful in cases like this. Now that we've set up the constructor, we can actually build out the build function for the widget. So this will be the actual visual layout of the widget everywhere that we actually use it inside of our application. The root widget for this particular widget will be a stack, and we'll make it so that this stack uses stack fit pass-through. This means that the constraints from the parent around this widget get passed into the children of the stack. We do this so that we can resize the text and reposition the text anywhere inside of our application. Inside of our stack, we can start with a transform, and the children for this transform will be our shade builder function, where we'll just pass in the context, the text, and then the shade color. Then for the actual transform, we want to translate the values of the text over a little bit. So in here we can use this matrix4.translateValues function. The matrix4 translation values function takes in 3 different values. The first 2 values are x and y, and the final value is z. Now because we just want to translate the text downward and to the right, we're going to give it a x and a y value, and we'll keep these values consistent so that it looks fairly decent. So I'll just put in 5.0 and 5.0 for those, and then for z we'll just leave it at 0.0. Now below the transform we can create another shade builder function. This one will take in the context, the text itself, and this time we'll take in the text color. So what will essentially happen is when we use this widget, it will create a small little stack, and we'll have the initial text that we've put into the widget with the 2 colors. So the first piece of text that you'll see at the top, which will be the main text, we'll have the original text color. Let's say it's white, and so say it says like example or something, so you'll see example, and then we'll have our transform which sort of has text which will appear down and to the right, and that text will be the shade color, so it will use this shade builder up here. So this is all we needed to do to complete our shaded text library. Now let's build an example project which will allow us to use this widget inside of it. In Visual Studio Code, if I hit Ctrl Shift and P, it will bring up this little menu, and if you type in Flutter new project, you can click it, and then you can type in the name of a project. In this case, I'm just going to call it example. So for the new project that we're creating, I want to put this example folder right inside of our shaded text folder so that we can easily have access to this library that we just created. So you can see here inside of the directory we have our .idea folder, then we have example, and then we have lib. So this is literally just one folder above where we have our library. We can gain access to the package by coming into the example projects pubspec.yaml and then referencing the package by path. We want our shaded text library, and we're getting it from the relative path, which is just double dot and a /. So now if we go into main.dart, and just an FYI, I've cleaned up this file a bit so that it's just got what we need. I can come to this import here and I can import the library that we just created. So I can type in shaded text and it will allow me to get package shaded text and then the shaded text.dart file that we just created. Now down inside of our second widget, which has the scaffold, I'll just put an app bar to make this look a little nicer, and then in the body we'll create a center, and then we'll build out a shaded text widget. You'll notice that when we create this shaded text widget, it will have a green squiggly line under it, and that's because it is asking for these parameters. So we have our 4 parameters: shaded color, text, and then the shade builder, and all of these are required because of the way that we built out the constructor for our application. Now let's set up our shaded text widget. Let's create our shade builder. So this takes in context, text, and color. And what we can do is we can just return a text widget where we're just putting the text in here, and then we can put in the style, which will be a text style object, and we can specifically reference the color. So the color will change based on where we're calling this shade builder, because if you remember, we have 2 shade builders being called. One gets called with the shade color, and then the other one gets called with the text color. And the one that gets called with the shade color gets translated down and to the right. So for our shade color, we'll use black, and then for our text color, we can use a light blue. And then we can just put in the text here as a string, and we can just say testing the shaded text widget. And here you can see this is what our shaded text widget looks like. So the top here is our blue, the text color, the light blue. And then the bottom is this black color. If we want to make this look more like an actual shadow, we can add with opacity to the shade color. So you can see here now the black color is a lot more translucent, and so it looks more like a shadow. And if we want to, we can come back into our library and manipulate the translation values, for instance. Here I'll make them drastically larger so that we can see the difference. Once we've done that, we want to do a reset rather than just a normal reload. So in my case, I just hit Control F5 and this will perform the reset. And you can see now the shadowed text is farther away from the actual normal text. If we want to give the user a bit more control with how the actual shadowed text looks, we can add the X and Y translation to the fields at the top and then add them to the constructor. So here they're both doubles, so we put in X trans and Y trans, and then inside of our constructor we can add them here without the required flags because they're not required values. Then down inside of our transform we can say, okay, well if X trans is null, then we just default to 4.0, and if Y trans is null, then we also default to 4.0. Now if we come back into our example project and we come inside of our shaded text widget, we can now set the translation for X and for Y. So here you can see that I'm setting them to 40.0. So now our shaded text is quite a bit further away from the initial text widget. And of course, if we want to, we can change the colors and everything for this shaded text. So we can make it so that the initial color is green and then the shadow color is just this orange color. And we can even increase the text size. If we wanted to, we could use a different widget for our actual shade builder function. So you can see here we've got a container that has a card inside of it, and then inside of the card we have our text, and we still have our text style as well. Now that we've done this, we now have a card here and a card here. So these 2 cards are translated based on the shadow translation. Obviously this is not ideal, and if we were going to continue to iterate on this library, we would make it so that if the user did put in a more complex widget, then maybe the shadow widget wouldn't have all of these other components to it, or maybe it would sort of blur out the card or lower the elevation or something like that. Of course, if we want to, we can increase the font size of our shade text. So here I've put in font size 48, and you can see it's quite a bit bigger. And I've also decreased the opacity of our shade color. Anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this tutorial. If you did, feel free to like and subscribe. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to leave them in the box below. And if you disliked the video, then by all means, downvote it as much as you like. Have a good night.